Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, got a Dungeons & Dragons video, because today I'm going to be talking a bit about Dungeons & Dragons and orcs, and essentially how underrated orcs are. Honestly, it seems like one of the most common enemies across various different medias. It doesn't matter if it's Tolkien or if it's Warhammer 40K or just about any other media out there. It seems like orcs are essentially this badass looking enemy that looks like a serious threat, but ends up not being a threat within the common themes. And within the common themes of things, essentially, they're a villainous horde that is disorganized and generally big and dumb. Actually, nothing more than big and dumb thugs, really. Um, and it always comes down to that it seems like orcs is nothing more than cannon fodder. And realistically, even in Dungeons and Dragons, they're depicted as being nothing more than a step up above goblins, which really isn't that hard unless you're a kobold. But that is exactly, in my opinion, why they are a threat. They usually easily outnumber their opponents in almost any battle, although sometimes things does kind of go on the flip side, but I've never seen a depiction of it. So they typically outnumber their opponents. They're typically stronger than their opponents. They're typically tougher than their opponents. And while disorganized, they can be rallied and organized by a powerful leader. And this also makes them dangerous because they're not going to commit to atypical tactics more than likely. Sure, their tactics will be simplified and it'll be mostly swarm horde type tactics, but they're still atypical basic tactics that orcs can use and employ on the battlefield that would actually make them a very serious threat. And in general, orcs actually has a lot of things in their favor, but yet they never seem to win any serious battles. Let alone, they never really seem to be a threat to your players outside of very low level players. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, I feel actually depicts the orcs pretty correctly, where in Warhammer 40K, orcs are actually world conquerors. Now, they don't necessarily conquer every world they go after. More often than not, they lose, and they tend to lose massive amounts of numbers. But usually, anyone fighting back against the orcs also suffer massive casualties. But enough of Warhammer 40K. Let's focus on Dungeons and Dragons and what can we do to make the orcs more of a threat, to make them more serious, especially towards higher level players, because essentially once your players reach level 5, orcs are getting to the point where they're pretty inconsequential. So let's discuss some ways to beef up your orcs, because might is always right. The first thing I could recommend is maybe if you're going to have an orc war chief, is to give your orc war chief levels in fighter or more than likely barbarian. Also, with that being said, they're also going to have some kind of improved equipment, maybe some changes and tweaks in their armor, and maybe even magic weapons if they're a high enough level, or bracers, or any other type of magic item for what it matters. Now, this one I kind of pulled from the pages of Warhammer Fantasy, but an orc war chief on a wyvern. Now, to me, that is badass. And wyverns are pretty badass themselves. Not as badass as dragons, but yeah, they're still pretty badass and can be a serious threat to players based on the players' levels. Also, could have an orc shaman, maybe with levels in druid or something along those lines. And also, besides of orc shaman, this is one I pulled from Warhammer 40K, and I actually like doing this in Dungeons and Dragons from time to time because it gives me an excuse to pull out my psionics handbook, and that is orc weird boys for those who aren't familiar with Warhammer 40K, weird boys are, think of sorcerers, but they use psychic powers. They have psychic powers instead of magic. So they're throwing psychic bolts and things like that in the battle on the battlefield. So orc weird boys could be pretty cool to use in Dungeons and Dragons, and I have used them a few times. Um, and the nice thing is, it gives me an excuse to pull out the old Psionics handbook that rarely ever gets used because people just don't seem to be extremely interested in psionic powers in Dungeons and Dragons, or at least the people I have played with. The next thing that you could have is also, well, slave forces. It is pretty easy for orcs to enslave goblins or kobolds or something along those lines and use them as cannon fodder to distract or even to weaken an enemy force, and then the orcs themselves can go in for the kill. With all that also being said, too, orcs would not be above hiring or enslaving some type of line breaker force, such as ogres. They would definitely employ ogres if they can. Why not some orc cavalry in the sense of boar boys? You could have orcs riding dire boars in the combat, and they'd have shields and pikes and stuff like that, and it would just look badass as all hell. And I think that would really throw your players off because orc cavalry is not something discussed very much. But I wouldn't be surprised if orcs could come up with some kind of solution for some type of cavalry. Also, massive archer formations. They're going to see humans employing archer formations, and they're going to employ them as well. Monkey see, monkey do, essentially. And that's one thing about the orcs that people don't seem to take into consideration that much. Orcs may be stupid, but they're going to do the monkey see, monkey do. If they see massive, if a war boss is sitting there watching a battlefield between two forces and he sees the humans flanking the enemy, then he's going to pick up on that and use that in his own battle plans, if you will, as well as using archer formations. Also, with that being said, why not have some better armed and armored orcs themselves? Maybe give them some version of scrappy plate mail and a polearm, and even increase their levels. Maybe use them as a royal bodyguard or as an elite unit within the orc army itself if you're doing a massive battle. Or they could be even just mercenaries, some type of mercenary force themselves. Once again, monkey see, monkey do. Orcs would easily be aware of mercenaries. I also mentioned a bit ago about orcs not being above working with other races, and orcs may not be above being led by other races, as we see in the Lord of the Rings, as Sauron, or no, this is Saruman, essentially led orcs into battle. Even though he had his smaller captains and generals and leaders and all that stuff, he still determined where they were going to fight and when they were going to fight. So they would not be above having some kind of other powerful, charismatic leader essentially lead them in battle, as long as that leader has proven themselves. I would also say that orcs may even find ways to hire mercenaries. I actually, within my Dungeons and Dragons campaign, I have a small force of goblins that are actually uses hand cannons, basically early gunpowder guns, as a mercenary force, and they kind of use these gunpowder guns with a combination of spears, so kind of like an early primitive version of pike and shot tactics, if you will, and the orcs would not be above actually using and hiring these goblins. Finally, the next thing I want to discuss is siege warfare. Orcs have been depicted in multiple mediums about using siege, being adapt to siege warfare, using siege towers, using siege engines, using ladders, scaling ladders, rams, etc. So yeah, make sure you have that type of stuff if you're per se using a giant orc army as a siege. Make sure you have that kind of stuff. And in my world, orcs even have some primitive cannons, mostly captured, but they still have those cannons available to them, which makes them even more dangerous in my world and even more dangerous during a siege. But anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap it up at that because I feel orcs are underrated, and you can't change my mind because they are or should be depicted as a much more serious threat than they are. Anyway, folks, hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you very much for tuning in and have yourself a wonderful day.